So next up, we have Jason Logan discussing Core Web Vitals for his guest talk. And so to preface the guest talk, this is a breakdown of Google Search Console's Core Web Vitals, the types of issues you will see, and how to approach handling them. This is going to be rolled out. Obviously, Jason's going to get into that in more detail. And before I bring him on, I'll give you a little bit about Jason. Jason Logan has worked on websites for over 15 years in multiple industries, including tourism, e-commerce, and lead generation. As a technical SEO, he works heavily with the inner workings of how Google interacts with websites. You're probably already picking that up. And for his company, Jason currently is employed as a Technical SEO Manager at Resulta, a full-service Nova Scotian marketing and technology company. So he's going to kick off his talk here soon, and then after that we'll have the Q&A. So drop questions in the chat if you like, or save them for the Q&A portion afterwards. Otherwise, I'm going to hand it over to Jason Logan, Core Web Vitals.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm just going to get my screen all up here. Hopefully everybody can see that all okay. Let's give me a thumbs up.
Looks good.
Awesome. Okay, so today I am here to talk about CWV from GSC, specifically LCP, FID, and CLS, or as I like to refer to it as, my guide to 3-letter acronyms. Too far. So Google ran into a problem. How can computers understand how a user experiences a website? The fact is, human brain, it can store around 2.5 petabytes of data. That's about 2.5 million gigabytes. So the ability for us to completely mimic the human brain is not even within a storage capacity of our current world. So what do? Well, we got to break it down. We got to break it down to as simple of items as possible. Sure, we're not going to be able to make AIs, but we can generally get the inference of some of these items as they appear. So generally speaking, we're talking about Core Web Vitals. Core Web Vitals, or CWV, is a new component that's going to be appearing inside of Search Console. And it will look something like this, plus or minus my Photoshop skills. And it appears underneath of enhancements. It's going to give you scores of good, need improvement, or poor URLs that kind of appear. And the idea being that those are pages that are affecting the user experience of your clients that are coming to your website. And in May, that's going to start affecting the rankings. And that is a really large conversation because we don't know how large of a change it's going to be, or how much weight there is going to be in it. So what do we see here? Right now, this Core Web Vitals enhancements bit, you can find that in the left-hand column of your Search Console, and it will have 2 of these beautiful little charts. One is mobile, one is for desktop, so that you can get the separation between the 2 devices. Generally speaking, the mobile device is based off of a Nexus. So if you're doing your testing there, that's most likely where you're going to see it. And then desktop will be running off of approximately 1024 pixels wide. So again, a very small segment of the overall view. So that said, we are going to be talking about 3 things. 3 things of major importance. We have LCP, which is all about how your page loads. You have FID, which is all about how long it kind of takes to click on things and do things. And then you have CLS, which is all about visual stability. does your site move around? Does it have stuff that's just making it difficult to continuously read it, or uncomfortable feeling when it's kind of loading? So we're going to start off with talking about largest contentful paint, which is LCP. Generally speaking, everyone's going to talk about it as LCP, but feel free to know that it is a largest contentful paint, and that is a object that is appearing within your starting viewport that takes the longest to load. Well, okay, that's great. Generally speaking, how do you tell? Well, you kind of have to take a visualized set. Take a screenshot of what your site looks like when it's done loading and find the element that's the biggest. In this case, I've gone and picked on Chronicle Herald. And as you can see, I've measured out all of the various components that are kind of sizable. And the fifth element down, this wonderful picture, is the largest, and it actually takes quite long for it to load. It will actually put it into the needs improvement section of Core Vitals for this. So how do we tell? The big thing here is we've got a scale. Google's going to have expectations on how long it's going to take for each of these to load. So overall, if you're below 2.5 seconds, you're peachy. If it's between 2.5 and 4, then it's gonna moderately affect you. And if you're any further than that, it's probably gonna hurt your website overall in rankings eventually. So what are the most common issues that we're gonna run into? Well, what we're talking about here is a server that's slow. And I'm not saying that you should go and switch hosting tomorrow. I'm saying that you need to consider that sometimes your code is going to affect how fast your page loads, and then you'll end up seeing these types of issues. A lot of popular styles of content right now have lazy loaded images. Lazy loading images is an amazing thing. It's very well thought out, except in the case of the largest contentful paint, where sometimes it will delay that actual timing by several seconds just because it's waiting for everything else. So you wait for all of the other loaded items to come through, and then you end up with a long loading element. I mean, it is what it is. So what can you do to fix that? Well, I mean, you just don't lazy load the image in, or you be careful about which images that you're lazy loading in. If it's below that first section of content, then it's well worth absolutely lazy loading it because it's not on the screen. No one's seeing it. But if it's within that first view of the page, just for the user to be able to know that the page is loading properly, you want to make sure that it's going to load in at the right time. Lastly, another very common issue that happens with this is inserting elements with JavaScript. So if you have, say, ads, if you're a news website, or statistics, or Google Map, or any of those types of stylized pieces of content that are loaded in with JavaScript, be aware that when you add an element into there, that needs to load, and that's going to affect your timings overall. So that's LCP. Next on the list, I've got first input delay, or FID. How long does it take for the page to respond when you click on it? This is actually the least common issue that I've been seeing appearing with any of my clients. But it does happen. Generally speaking, you want to have it respond as quick as possible. Less than 100 milliseconds is generally viewed, but I think we've all experienced that moment of looking at your phone, trying to click a link, and you click it 4 or 5 times because you're not sure if it's even doing anything. And that is the concern that Google is seeing. And it's an easy way for them to tell how well the website's actually functioning. So again, 100 milliseconds for good, 100 to 300 for needs improvement. Anything bigger than that is no good. So again, common problems. We run into slow server responses. So if you have a slow server, one thing you can always do is cache everything, which is always a blessing and a curse. But when done properly, it can save you a lot of trouble. Because if your server code takes a long time to load or to build a page, and you need to have all that content in there, if it's cached, then the user doesn't have to wait, and it saves a lot of that trouble. Now, on the other side of that, though, you have JavaScript. Well, if you have JavaScript running on your clicks, that includes everything from Google Tag Manager in some cases, or anything that's loading responsibly, a view more, for example, that loads more articles in, or anything along those lines, then that interactivity needs to be quick. It has to be fast, or you're going to start running into first input delay. Now, again, it's not the most common one because it's very specific to a very particular problem. As long as your server is well set up, your website is well built, you don't have 500 JavaScript files running on all of your clicks, then majority of the time you should be fine with this. But if you do find that you're seeing this showing up in your Search Console, always go out, have a look at what you have running on your JavaScript or how fast your server is responding, and then come back and have that idea in place when you're trying to address it. And lastly, I have probably the most important of the three, the cumulative layout shift. And this one's really interesting because it's the way that they measure it is so mathematical. What they're doing is they're giving you a score between 0 and 1, some decimal place thereof. And if you have lower than 0.1, you're good. If you're lower than 0.25, need some improvement, and then everything else is bad. But how does that number even come to fruition? I mean, it seems so foreign. But there's actually a math formula that they're using. And what they're doing is they want to be able to calculate how much of the page changes while the page is loading. So what they do is they take the size from the initial point and then the end point of when it's done loading, and then figure out what the difference is. So in this case, I've taken a screenshot of the Chronicle Herald loading. And as you can see, there's a image there on the loading one, just beside Dr. Robert Strang. And you'll note that it is a broken image. That is because of lazy loading. The image itself is lazy loaded in, absolutely not a terrible thing, but as you can see, it's changing the location of that block of text to appear below it. Once the site is actually done loading, you can see that image clearly, and that the text that was there is much, much lower. So what we end up with is, okay, so you take the width and height that it was, then you get the percentage change between the 1 and the 2. So in this case, it's going from 0 to its full width. So that's 100%, which is a lot. So that ends up being 1 point. And then it ends up calculating how much does it actually physically move. So if it's moving from the top left-hand corner to the middle of the page, then that would be a 50% move. Then they multiply the two together, and that's how they get to these decimal numbers. In this case, it would be a 0.5. 0.5, obviously on this scale, is quite huge. It would put them well into poor. And that's really problematic because there's a lot of things that can cause this. Images is just one example. We're talking about fonts. Fonts are a major design element that is commonly placed. And a font itself is a beautiful part of branding, of your navigation, of everything. But when you load fonts in a browser that someone doesn't have, there's a resizing that occurs. That resizing ends up being a few pixels here and there, which really doesn't seem like a lot, but depending on what you've chosen as your primary font, if that font doesn't load, you'll get varied results. I have seen in multiple times where headings that are 1 line will turn into 2 lines, and that's a layout shift. I've seen navigations that go from being 2 lines of navigation down to 1 because of the font coming in. And in that case, you're talking about an entire size of your button, of your navigation, of the entire content moving up. I definitely can speak and say that I have read many an article, or started reading one, had an image load in, lost my place while I was reading. It's all about those types of topics. JavaScript, again, surprisingly, the JavaScript issue will always continue. If you add an element into the page and it wasn't there before, it's going to move everything around. So what do? Well, the best thing you can do is try to tell the browser how big something is before you load it. If Chrome knows that, oh, I have a box here, it's gonna be an ad, it's 200 by 500 pixels. I know AdWords is gonna put it there, but I don't have it yet. So I just want to kind of save this space. Just, you can put a div tag around it and just set the width and height of it. And that would fix the entire layout problem from the start. And that's, generally speaking, the best way to deal with it. Is you try and find ways to mitigate the change in widths and heights. For fonts, that means trying to find a font prior to the loading of the original font that actually has the same character width. If it has the same character width, then that means that the font itself won't cause any layout changes because they're all the same width. Make sure that they're the same font sizes. Make sure that you're loading all your style sheets in at the same time, or whatever makes sense for that point. Again, like images are a very interesting issue because of the way that they load. There's 4 or 5 different ways to load in images. We're talking backgrounds, we're talking image tags, picture tags, we're talking about source sets, we're talking about SVGs, and there's all of these different ways, and they all have different ways of kind of changing it so that it ends up being more of a width or a height related issue. For example, on a regular image tag, you can put a width and a height. If you do that, then the browser already knows how much space it's going to take. Same goes with all of the source sets. And again, you can always create those div areas that are approximately the right size to minimize the amount of shift that's happening. Now, overall, layout shift is probably going to be the one that's going to show up the most and be the largest issue. So I would love to see as many questions on the topic as possible. Feel free. It's your time to ask all of the best questions you can come up with. So I would love to say thanks for listening to me jabber on for half an hour. And I'll gladly hand it back to Kenzie and Mike.
Thank you so much, Mr. Logan. Very much appreciate you breaking that down for us laymen. Myself, I'm referring to.
I'll let Kenzie, if you want to read the question there from Yazid, another great question.
Awesome. Yeah, from Yazid here. Are you suggesting that images and JavaScript elements like ad units be positioned below the fold for optimum CLS? As you can imagine, the sales team would be upset with lowering visibility of the ad unit. That's a good question. Yeah.
No, absolutely. That's a completely valid question. No, by no means am I saying that you should move your ad units out of above the fold. Like, it should be above the fold. That's how you make money. Don't change that. What I am saying though is if you have an ad unit, you know how big that ad unit is. So set the width and height around that ad unit to be a specific value so that the browser knows how big it is before the ad loads in. If you do that, you can avoid the issue of getting that layout shift that